You're looking at a pile of rocks, 2.3 million of them to be exact. Each one weighs an average of 2.5 tons, some weigh as much as 80 tons, and somebody had to move every single one of them, without wheels that worked in sand, without pulleys strong enough for the job, without a single crane. No slaves in chains, whip-cracking overseers, and endless suffering, like you were taught in school. Just numbers. Staggering. Precise. Almost accountant-like numbers. Because the Great Pyramid of Giza wasn't built by magic, or aliens, or an army of the enslaved. It was built by a budget. And today, you're going to see exactly what that budget looked like. Let's start with the timeline because it changes everything about how you think of this project. The pyramid was built for the pharaoh Khufu, starting around 2560 BCE. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the fact, claimed it took 20 years and cost the labor of 100,000 men. For centuries, that number stuck. It's wrong. Modern archaeologists using workers' campsite excavations near Giza, led by the Egyptologist Mark Lenner, now estimate a workforce closer to 20,000 people at any given time. Not 100,000. 20,000 people working in rotating shifts, building one of the largest structures on Earth in roughly 20 years. That's not sloppier math, that's a fundamentally different picture. A smaller, better organized workforce, doing a harder job, faster than you'd expect. Now do the arithmetic with me, because this is where it gets real. 2.3 million blocks over roughly 20 years of construction. That's about 800 blocks a day. One block, roughly every 2 minutes, every single day, for 2 decades straight. No weekends, no holidays, day after day after day. Try to picture your own job running at that pace for 20 years without ever falling behind schedule. That's the kind of project management you're dealing with. So who were these 20,000 workers, and what did they cost the state? This is the part that surprised historians the most. Excavations of the workers' village near the pyramid, again led by Lenner's team, uncovered something nobody expected. Bakeries. Breweries. Massive food production facilities capable of feeding thousands of people a day. The workers weren't slaves living on scraps. They were paid laborers, and their wages were paid in food. Bread and beer, primarily, supplemented with meat on a regular basis, something genuinely rare for common Egyptians at the time. Cattle bones found at the site suggest the workforce was eating beef regularly enough that historians now believe skilled pyramid laborers ate better than most farmers in the Egyptian countryside. Read that again. Building the pyramid may have been one of the better jobs you could get in ancient Egypt. Here's where the real economics show up. Feeding 20,000 people a day, for 20 years, at a level better than the average diet, required an agricultural surplus of enormous scale. Estimates from Egyptologist Catherine Bard suggest that supporting the pyramid workforce required grain and livestock drawn from across the entire Nile Valley, essentially a nationwide tax and supply system funneling food toward one single construction site. This wasn't a local project. It was the ancient equivalent of a national infrastructure budget, pulling resources from an entire country's economy and directing them at one man's tomb. Let's talk stone, because the material costs alone are almost incomprehensible. The pyramid contains an estimated 5.9 million tons of limestone. Most of it was quarried locally, just south of the plateau, which kept transport costs down. But the outer casing stones, the smooth white limestone that once made the pyramid gleam in the sun, came from Tura, across the Nile, roughly 8 miles away. And the interior burial chamber used granite blocks hauled from Aswan, more than 500 miles up the Nile, some of those blocks weighing over 50 tons each. Moving a 50-ton block 500 miles with no wheeled carts capable of bearing that weight on sand meant floating it down the river on barges during the annual flood season, then dragging it the final stretch on wetted sand to reduce friction. A technique confirmed by tomb paintings and later verified through modern physics experiments. Every mile of that journey cost labor, time, and food for the people doing the hauling. Now let's put a modern price tag on this, because numbers only mean something when you can compare them. A frequently cited modern engineering estimate, based on the labor hours, materials, and logistics involved, puts the cost of building the Great Pyramid today, using modern construction methods and wages, somewhere in the range of $5 billion. Some estimates run higher once you account for the specialized stone cutting and the sheer scale of material transport. For comparison, that's in the same range as some of the most expensive stadiums and skyscrapers ever constructed in the modern world. Except the ancient Egyptians didn't have diesel engines, steel cables, or electricity. They had ropes, copper chisels, wooden sledges, and 20,000 well-fed workers moving with extraordinary precision. So where did the money, or rather the resources, actually come from? Egypt in Khufu's era ran on a tax system based almost entirely on labor and goods rather than coined currency, which didn't exist yet. Farmers along the Nile owed a portion of their harvest and a period of mandatory labor service to the state each year, especially during the months when the Nile flooded and farming itself was impossible. That flood season is key. The pyramid wasn't built by pulling farmers away from their crops. It was built during the exact months when there was nothing else for them to do anyway. The state simply redirected labor that would otherwise have sat idle for 3 to 4 months a year, gave it food and purpose, and turned it into one of the largest engineering projects in human history. From a purely economic standpoint, that's not exploitation. That's remarkably efficient use of an otherwise wasted resource. But don't mistake efficiency for cheapness. Even with clever timing, the raw scale of the undertaking was staggering for its era. Historians estimate the total value of resources funneled into the Giza pyramid complex, including the 2 smaller pyramids and surrounding temples built for Khufu's successors, would represent a percentage of Egypt's total economic output, comparable to how a modern government might spend a meaningful slice of its entire annual budget on a single flagship project, sustained not for 1 year, but for multiple generations in a row. Khufu's pyramid took roughly 20 years. His son Khafra built another nearly as large. His grandson Menkaure built a third, smaller one after that. 3 generations of pharaohs, pouring a significant share of the nation's surplus labor and grain into a single 3-mile stretch of desert plateau. Why? Because the pyramid wasn't just a tomb. It was a statement about a functioning, wealthy, organized state, one so well run that it could feed, house, and coordinate 20,000 skilled workers for 2 decades while the rest of the country kept farming, trading, and functioning normally. A weak, poor kingdom cannot build a pyramid. Only a rich one can afford to look like it's wasting money. You don't build pyramids anymore, at least not literally. But you felt this exact economic instinct before, without realizing it. A government building an absurdly expensive stadium nobody asked for. A company throwing money at a headquarters tower with no functional purpose beyond looking impressive. A billionaire funding a spaceflight that serves no immediate need. All of it says the same thing the pyramid said 4,500 years ago. We have so much surplus, we can afford to spend a fortune proving it. The stone changes. The method of payment changes. Coins now instead of bread and beer. But the underlying economic logic, wealth converting itself into permanence, into stone. You can see from space, has never really gone away. 2.3 million blocks, 20,000 workers, 20 years, somewhere around 5 billion of today's dollars. Numbers that, once you actually add them up, tell you the truth, the myths never could. The pyramids weren't built by slaves under the whip. They were built by a government wealthy enough and organized enough to run one of the most efficient labor and supply operations the ancient world had ever seen. And they built it to remind everyone, forever, exactly how much they could afford to spend.